All right, welcome in everybody to our deep dive. And today we're taking a look at Exodus chapter 5.
Yeah.
This one was actually a listener request.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, somebody really wanted to get into this section, and I can see why. Because we are at a turning point, I think, in the Exodus story. Things are really about to ramp up.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment for sure.
So we're going from, last time we talked about how Moses is, getting his instructions from God and proving to the Israelites, that he's the real deal.
Right.
But now we're into okay, he's going to face Pharaoh.
Exactly.
And it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, and things get worse for the Israelites before they get better, which I think always throws people for a loop.
You think it would be like, okay, God's on the scene, miracle time, let's go.
Right, like pack your bags, freedom is coming.
But no, it's not quite that simple.
Not quite.
All right, so before we get into all the drama of chapter 5, let's do a super quick recap.
Okay.
So, last time in Exodus, God gives Moses that power to perform miracles, turning the staff into a snake, all that stuff.
Yeah, the class.
So there's no doubt about who's backing him up.
Exactly. Proof for Moses himself, because he's still kind of grappling with this whole thing. And proof for the people.
For everyone watching.
Right, like a big cosmic sign.
All right, so armed with this miracle power, Moses and his brother Aaron, they go straight to Pharaoh. And they make a pretty bold demand, right?
Oh, it's straight to the top.
It's like, let my people go.
No messing around.
They want the Israelites to be released so they can hold a religious festival out in the wilderness.
Right. Seems simple enough on the surface, right? Just a little festival.
Yeah, it's a few days in the desert, no big deal.
But of course it's never that simple.
Because here's where that clash of worldviews comes in.
Right, and this is key to understanding what happens next.
Okay, I'm ready. Lay it on me.
So in ancient Egypt, Pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was like a god king.
Okay, so even more powerful than your average king.
Oh yeah, divine right and all that.
So when Pharaoh hears this request, and he says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" He's not just dismissing the God of the Israelites.
Exactly. He's rejecting the very idea that any other God even exists.
Like, how dare you even bring up this other God to me?
Right. It's a complete denial of Yahweh's authority.
So it's way more than just saying no to a festival.
Oh, yeah. This is a total power struggle, a cosmic showdown in the making.
God versus Pharaoh, freedom versus slavery.
The stakes are high.
And just to make things even more intense, Pharaoh doesn't just say no. He actually decides to make life harder for the Israelites.
Yeah, this is where we see the human cost of this conflict.
So what does he do?
He orders them to gather their own straw for making bricks, but they still have to produce the same number of bricks every day.
Oh man, can you imagine the labor involved in that?
Back-breaking, exhausting.
Especially without the straw to bind it all together.
Yeah, it just adds another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation.
It's brutal. And sadly, it makes you think about all the ways forced labor and exploitation still happen in the world today.
Absolutely. The echoes of this ancient story are still with us.
And it doesn't stop there, because this increase in suffering, it leads to another layer of conflict.
Right. The pressure is building.
You got the Israelite foremen, they're caught in the middle.
Yeah, they're stuck between Pharaoh's demands and their own people's exhaustion and anger.
I can't imagine being in that position.
It's a no-win situation.
So what happens?
They end up turning on Moses and Aaron.
They blame the messengers?
Yeah, it's like, hey, thanks a lot for making things worse.
I bet Moses was feeling pretty good about himself at this point.
Right. Talk about a leadership challenge.
You go to confront the most powerful person in the world, and everyone's mad at you.
It's not exactly a smooth start.
All right, so where does Moses go from here? What does he do with all this frustration and anger?
Well, he does something that I think is very relatable, even thousands of years later.
I'm intrigued.
He goes back to God and basically says, wait a minute, I did what you asked and things are even worse. What's going on here?
So he's questioning God.
Oh yeah, he's pouring his heart out, questioning the whole mission.
And you know what? I kind of get it.
Right, it's raw, it's honest.
It shows that even this great leader chosen by God, even he had moments of doubt and frustration.
We all have those moments.
So how does God respond to this very human outburst from Moses?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, now you've really got me hooked.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2.
All right, everybody. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
So we left off with Moses, really feeling like his mission has completely backfired.
Yeah, questioning everything.
Yeah, pouring his heart out to God. And, I have to admit, I was kind of expecting like a divine smackdown.
Yeah, you don't question the Almighty, right?
Right, you'd think so.
A little lightning bolt.
But instead of anger, what we see is actually patience and reassurance from God. He reminds Moses of the covenant. That sacred promise he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob way back when.
Okay, so like a reminder that God always keeps his promises.
Exactly. It's like an unbreakable agreement.
Okay, I get that. But how does that help Moses in this particular situation?
Well, God reaffirms that covenant, right? Emphasizing that promise to free the Israelites from slavery and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey, the Promised Land.
Yeah, the Promised Land.
It's like God is saying, Moses, I know things look bleak right now.
Yeah, they really do.
But this is all part of a much bigger plan. Just trust me.
Okay, I can see how that would be comforting in a way.
Right, like a little reassurance.
But then things take a bit of a turn, don't they?
Yeah, this is where it gets tricky.
Because God also reveals to Moses that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart.
Right, now that's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a concept that's always been a bit hard for me to wrap my head around.
I think it throws a lot of people off.
Because why would God do that? It seems like it contradicts the whole idea of free will, doesn't it?
It's a question that's puzzled theologians for centuries.
Yeah.
But I think one thing to remember here is that Pharaoh had already shown his stubbornness.
He wasn't exactly Mr. Nice Guy.
Right. He'd already repeatedly refused to acknowledge God's authority.
And was determined to keep the Israelites enslaved.
Yeah, he was pretty set in his ways.
So it's not like God was forcing Pharaoh to be cruel.
No, Pharaoh had already made that choice.
He was going down that path anyway.
Exactly. And in a way, by hardening Pharaoh's heart, God is actually setting the stage for something truly extraordinary.
Okay, I'm listening.
He's about to unleash a series of increasingly dramatic plagues on Egypt.
The plagues. Here we go.
Each one specifically designed to challenge the power of the Egyptian gods.
So these plagues weren't just random acts of destruction.
Not at all. They were meticulously orchestrated.
It's like a divine symphony.
Think about it. In ancient Egypt, the Nile River wasn't just a source of water. It was considered sacred, a symbol of the god Happy.
Right. It was life-giving.
So when God turns the Nile into blood, he's directly challenging Happy's power.
Wow. So it's not just a random disaster, it's a targeted attack.
Yeah, it's very symbolic.
So that was just the first plague.
Exactly, and it escalates from there. Each plague more dramatic than the last. Frogs, lice, flies, disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, you name it.
Talk about an Old Testament greatest hits compilation.
Right, and with each plague, Pharaoh hardens his heart even more.
Refusing to release the Israelites.
He's digging in his heels.
It's almost like God is systematically dismantling the entire Egyptian belief system.
Brick by brick, plague by plague.
Like he's saying, you think these gods are so powerful? Let me show you what real power looks like.
That's a great way to put it.
And what's amazing is how these plagues, they seem to mirror the order of creation in Genesis.
Yeah, it's like God is undoing creation in reverse.
So this isn't just a story about freeing the Israelites. It's about God demonstrating his power on a cosmic scale.
Exactly. It's a story about the nature of God, the nature of power, and ultimately the nature of freedom.
So will Pharaoh finally relent?
Well, to find that out, you'll have to stick with us as we dive into the final part of this episode.
So we've got this incredible showdown happening, right? God's revealing his power through these plagues, and each one is targeting specific Egyptian gods and goddesses.
Yeah, it's not random.
And meanwhile, Pharaoh's just digging in his heels.
Refusing to budge.
You have to wonder, what would it take to convince someone like that? Especially someone who sees themselves as a god.
It's a great question, and it's important to remember that these plagues weren't just about causing chaos or just showing off God's power.
Right.
They were really a deliberate dismantling of the entire Egyptian worldview.
It's like God saying, okay, you think these gods are so powerful, let me show you what real power looks like.
Exactly. And we talked about the Nile turning to blood.
Right.
But think about the plague of frogs.
Okay.
In Egyptian mythology, the frog goddess Hecate was associated with fertility and new life.
So like springtime and abundance.
Exactly. So by sending hordes of frogs, God is essentially taking over Hecate's domain and turning it into something chaotic and destructive.
Like twisting their own beliefs against them.
Yeah, and it's not just Hecate. You have the plague of darkness challenging Ra, the sun god.
Who was like the top god in their pantheon. Now.
Exactly. So each plague had this symbolic meaning. It was a message aimed at both Pharaoh and the Egyptian people.
Like God was working on multiple levels.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about power, it was also about justice.
Right, because the Israelites were suffering under this horrible oppression.
They were being denied basic human rights.
You know, it's interesting because even today when we talk about injustice, we often use the language of plagues.
Yeah, like plagues of poverty, plagues of violence.
Like that imagery from Exodus is still so powerful even after thousands of years.
It speaks to something universal in the human experience, right?
Yeah.
The desire for freedom, the struggle against oppression.
The hope for a better future.
Exactly. And those themes resonate across time and cultures.
Okay, but back to Pharaoh. Did any of these plagues actually make him change his mind? All this incredible power on display.
Well, it's fascinating because the text describes Pharaoh's heart as being hardened.
Hardened.
Both by his own stubbornness and indeed by God's intervention.
So that raises the question of free will versus destiny, right?
Yeah, was Pharaoh really making his own choices, or was he destined to resist God's will?
I mean, if you were in Moses' sandals facing this guy who just refused to budge, what would you be thinking?
I think it had to be incredibly frustrating.
To say the least.
But you also see Moses' faith deepening throughout this whole ordeal.
So, like, the trials are actually strengthening him.
He keeps going back to God, pleading for the Israelites' freedom, even when it seems completely hopeless.
And that's such an important lesson, isn't it?
Yeah.
To hold on to hope, even in the face of incredible challenging.
To trust that there's a bigger plan at work.
Even when we can't see it.
And I think ultimately that's what the Exodus story is all about.
Okay, I like that.
It's about the triumph of faith over fear, of freedom over oppression, of hope over despair.
It's a powerful message.
And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, liberation is possible.
So what can we take away from all of this? I think for me, it's a reminder that the struggle for freedom, it's ongoing.
It's not just something in the past.
It's happening right now all over the world.
And this story calls on each of us to be a part of that struggle, to stand up for justice, to speak out against oppression.
To fight for a world where everyone can live with dignity and freedom.
Well said.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those powerful ideas.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive into Exodus chapter 5.
Until next time.